Let me take you back to a quiet morning, not too long ago.
A man in his early 60s sat alone at his kitchen table. The sun was rising gently through the window, casting golden light across the room. His coffee steamed beside him untouched. He wasn't reading the paper or checking his phone. He was lost in thought. He had just finished another night of restlessness, another night where instead of turning to conversation or comfort, he turned inward, to a habit he rarely spoke of, one that left him feeling both satisfied and strangely empty. It wasn't always this way. There was a time when his body felt alive and familiar, when intimacy was joyful, when desire brought connection rather than quiet shame. But now things were changing. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, subtly, like a familiar song that no longer stirred the same feelings. He didn't know whether it was age, hormones, loneliness, or simply the passage of time. What he did know was this something felt off, and he was beginning to wonder if he was the only one who felt this way. This video is for him, and for any man who has ever sat in that quiet kitchen wondering what's happening to his body, his desires, and his sense of self. Because here's the truth. What we do in private can affect every part of our lives, especially as we get older. Today we are going to talk openly, honestly, and without judgment about masturbation after 50. Not to shame, not to scare, but to understand. To uncover the quiet truths that no one ever taught us. To explore the ways this simple act can either support or sabotage our energy, our relationships, and our emotional well-being. And most importantly, to ask the question few dare to ask, has this once harmless habit become something that's quietly taking more than it gives? If you've ever wondered about the real impact of self-pleasure at this stage in life, stay with me. The conversation we're about to have could change the way you see yourself, not just as a man, but as a whole human being. Because this isn't just about sex. It's about health. It's about freedom. And it's about taking back your power, one honest insight at a time. When Daniel turned 55, he thought he was doing everything right. He walked, every morning had a fairly balanced diet, and still considered himself in decent shape. But something started to shift. At first, it was subtle. He noticed it was taking him a little longer to feel aroused. Then, over time, the sensations he once knew like the back of his hand felt different. Not gone, but distant. Muted. He tried to brush it off, blamed it on stress, on work, on not sleeping well. But deep down, he wondered if it was something more. Something age was slowly rewriting inside him. What Daniel didn't know at the time was that this was completely natural. You see, after 50, a man's body begins to move at a different rhythm. Testosterone, the hormone that fuels energy, mood, and sexual function, starts to decline gradually. It doesn't disappear overnight, but like a quiet tide pulling back from the shore, it begins to shape a new landscape. It's not just testosterone either. Blood circulation slows a little, nerve sensitivity shifts, the brain's response to stimulation changes. What once sparked immediate desire might now need a gentler touch, a slower buildup, or a deeper emotional connection. And yet so many men misread these changes as signs of failure. They feel shame when the body doesn't respond like it did at 30. They hide it, avoid intimacy, or they double down on habits like masturbation to try and prove to themselves that they're still capable, still in control. But the truth is this, your body isn't broken. It's evolving. Think of it like a musical instrument. Over time, the strings stretch, the wood matures, and the sound deepens. You don't throw it away. You learn to play it differently. You tune it more often. You listen more closely. That's what midlife intimacy is about. Not chasing what once was, but honoring what is. For Daniel, the turning point came during a quiet evening walk. He realized he had been so focused on performance, on function, that he had forgotten to feel. He started reading more, paying attention to how his body responded, experimenting with different ways of building arousal slowly, respectfully, and gradually something beautiful happened. The pressure faded, the frustration softened. What returned wasn't just physical pleasure, it was a kind of peace. Here's the small lesson tucked inside this story. Aging doesn't mean losing your sexuality. It means learning to meet it in a new way, one that requires patience, awareness, and a little bit of grace. And once you understand this shift, something else becomes clear. Masturbation, when practiced with presence, can actually help you relearn this new rhythm. It becomes more than release. It becomes reflection. But, and here's where things get complicated, it can also go the other way. Because for every man like Daniel who learns to adapt, there are many others who quietly slip into habits that feel comforting on the surface, but underneath start to erode their connection with life itself. And that's what we'll explore next. Because when masturbation turns into a way of coping with loneliness, rather than reconnecting with yourself, something subtle but powerful begins to change. Let's talk about that. There's a kind of silence that settles in the evenings. For James, a 62-year-old retired teacher, it started not long after his wife passed away. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that doesn't just fill the room, but echoes inside your chest. At first, he tried to stay busy. Gardening, reading, organizing drawers he hadn't opened in years. But by nightfall, when the lights dimmed and the world slowed down, the weight of that silence returned. That's when he began turning to something familiar, something private, something that gave him, even if just for a moment, a feeling of relief. Masturbation became his way of numbing the loneliness. He didn't think much of it at first. It helped him sleep. It was a release, a way to feel something. But as the months went on, it became a habit, then a routine, eventually almost a reflex. He wasn't doing it out of desire anymore. He was doing it to fill a space, to feel less alone. And slowly, without realizing it, began to replace other things. Phone calls with friends, walks in the park, meals that used to feel worth cooking. You see, we often think of masturbation as a physical act, but in truth, it's deeply emotional, especially as we grow older. For many men, it becomes a way to self-soothe, to escape the ache of grief, the sting of aging, the subtle erosion of identity that comes when life changes faster than we can adapt. There's nothing wrong with seeking comfort. The problem begins when comfort becomes isolation, and that's what happened to James. The more he turned inward, the less he reached outward. And over time, the very act that once gave him a sense of control began to quietly erode his connection to the world around him. Here's the lesson hidden in his story. Masturbation, like any coping mechanism, should never become your only lifeline, because when it does, it doesn't just soothe the pain, it starts to delay your healing. If you find yourself turning to it, not from desire, but from habit, from boredom, or from sadness, pause. Ask yourself what you truly need in that moment. Is it touch, or is it connection? Is it stimulation, or is it comfort? And if the answer is comfort, maybe the most healing thing you can do is call a friend. Step outside, write a letter, take a deep breath, and remind yourself you are not alone, even if it sometimes feels that way. Now that we understand how emotions and habits can intertwine, let's turn to something equally important. Because while emotional dependency is one piece of the puzzle, there's another layer that affects the very core of your physical response as a man. And that's what we'll explore next. How compulsive stimulation can quietly rewire your body, your nerves, and your ability to feel. Let's dive into that. Mark had always been confident when it came to intimacy. Even in his late 50s, he still felt a strong connection to his body. But over time, something began to change, something subtle, something frustrating. He started noticing that it took longer to feel aroused, touch didn't feel quite the same. And during moments that once brought him pleasure with ease, he found himself needing more pressure, more intensity, more stimulation, just to feel something close to what he used to. So, like many men, he adjusted. He leaned into masturbation with greater frequency. He watched more explicit content. He changed his routine, hoping to reignite that spark. But the more he pushed, the less responsive his body seemed to become. What Mark didn't realize was that his brain and body were trying to tell him something. There's a phenomenon known as desensitization. It happens when the nerves that once responded quickly to touch to arousal become dulled over time by overstimulation. Think of it like this. If you listen to music at full volume all the time, your ears begin to adapt. Soon the same song feels flat unless the volume goes even higher. The same thing happens with pleasure. If your body becomes accustomed to intense, high-speed, high-friction stimulation, especially from solo activity or visual content, it starts to lose its sensitivity to gentler, more natural forms of touch. This isn't just a theory, it's neuroscience. The brain's reward system is built on novelty and balance. When overstimulated, the receptors that govern arousal and satisfaction begin to down-regulate. What once felt deeply pleasurable now feels distant. And that distance can create a quiet kind of panic. Mark began avoiding intimacy altogether. He feared disappointing his partner. He felt disconnected, even defective, all from a habit he once saw as harmless. Here's the truth he eventually came to learn, and one that many men are never told. Your sexual response is not just about desire, it's about conditioning, and your body learns from repetition. If you teach it to respond only to intense solo stimulation, that's what it will crave. And in turn, it may forget how to respond to slower, more emotional, more human connection. But here's the good news. Just as the body can unlearn, it can also relearn. Mark took a break. Not forever, but long enough to let his nervous system reset. He began approaching touch differently, more slowly, more mindfully, with more presence. And little by little, sensation returned. Not the exact same as before, but richer, fuller, and far more connected to who he had become. So here's the lesson. Your body is not broken. It's simply responding to how it's being treated. Give it time. Give it variety. Give it space to remember. Because true intimacy doesn't live in intensity. It lives in awareness. And speaking of awareness, there's another layer we need to explore. Because even when the physical body is functioning well, something else can still be quietly drained by compulsive self-pleasure. Your energy, your drive. That subtle spark that makes you feel alive in the morning, ready to meet the day. So next, let's talk about how this habit, when out of balance, can start to pull from your mental and physical vitality in ways you might not expect. Let's explore that together. It was a Tuesday morning when Robert realized something had changed. He had just turned 60, retired a few months earlier, and for the first time in years, his mornings were truly his own. No meetings, no commute, no deadlines, just time. At first, it felt like freedom. He could sleep in, make a slow breakfast, take long walks. But slowly, almost without noticing, his days began to follow a different pattern. He would wake up, feel a little bored, then scroll his phone. That scroll often led him to something more stimulating, and before long his mornings started with a private habit that had once been occasional, now becoming routine. Afterward, he'd sit at the table, sipping cold coffee, staring at the clock. He wasn't tired exactly, but he wasn't energized either. He felt foggy, unmotivated, even a bit low, like the day had already slipped past him before it really began, and he couldn't figure out why. But here's what was happening. When masturbation becomes a frequent or reflexive habit, especially when done first thing in the morning, or used as a way to fill empty time, it can quietly drain the body's natural energy reserves. Biochemically, every climax releases a surge of feel-good hormones, dopamine, prolactin, oxytocin, followed by a drop. For some men, especially past midlife, that drop hits harder. Instead of feeling relaxed, they feel flat. Instead of refreshed, they feel unmotivated, especially if the act wasn't driven by desire but by habit or boredom. It's like pushing a reset button before the system was even fully awake. And over time, this pattern can affect more than just your mornings. It can dull your sense of drive, make workouts feel harder to start, make social interactions feel like effort, even blur your sense of purpose. Robert wasn't depressed. He wasn't sick. He was just depleted. And when he traced it back, the pattern was clear. So he made a small change. Just one. He decided not to touch himself before noon. Not forever. Just as an experiment. Instead, he filled his mornings with small, energizing rituals. Stretching. Journaling. Going outside even for 10 minutes. Talking to someone he hadn't spoken to in a while. And something surprising happened. His mornings came back to life. The fog lifted. The quiet joy returned. Not because he stopped self-pleasure completely, but because he gave his body time to build energy before releasing it. Here's the quiet truth. Masturbation, when done mindfully, can support your vitality, but when done out of routine, it can become a slow leak in your emotional and physical battery. So, ask yourself, when you do it, do you feel more alive afterward? Or a little more empty? It's a simple question, but the answer says so much. Now, speaking of emptiness, there's another area this habit can slowly begin to touch, one that often goes unnoticed until it's too late, and that's your relationships, not just romantic ones, but your connection to people, to life, to the world around you. Because when solo pleasure becomes the main source of intimacy, something precious starts to fade. Let's talk about that. David had been married for over 30 years. He loved his wife. Truly. They had built a life together, raised 2 children, weathered hardships, celebrated victories. But lately, something in their connection had started to fade. Not in a dramatic way. There were no fights, no betrayals, just a quiet drifting apart. They still ate dinner together, watched television in the evenings, slept in the same bed. But there was a kind of silence between them that wasn't there before. Not the comfortable kind, the other kind. The kind that grows when people stop reaching for one another. What David didn't realize was that without intending to, he had slowly replaced one form of intimacy with another. Over time, he had turned more inward, more private. He found it easier to meet his own needs alone than to risk the vulnerability of reconnecting physically or emotionally with his wife. He told himself it was harmless. A release, a routine. But in truth, it had become something more, a retreat. You see, intimacy isn't just about sex. It's about presence, eye contact, unspoken understanding. And when solo pleasure becomes the main or only source of intimacy in your life, it often starts to dull your desire, not just for sex with a partner, but for connection itself. It's not that David no longer loved his wife. He simply forgot how to reach for her. And she, sensing his distance, stopped reaching back. This is a story more common than most people think. Masturbation, when done mindfully, can coexist with a healthy relationship. In fact, for many couples, it's part of a balanced sexual life. But when it becomes a substitute rather than a supplement, something vital begins to fade. Touch loses its urgency. Conversations become shorter. The bedroom grows quieter. And soon, it's not just the sexual connection that disappears. It's the emotional one, too. David's turning point came one evening when he noticed his wife quietly crying in the kitchen. She didn't say anything at first, but when he asked, she finally spoke the words he hadn't been ready to hear. "I miss you, even though you're right here. I feel like I've lost you. That moment broke something open. He realized then that what he thought was a private habit had slowly created a wall. Not overnight, but brick by brick over months and years until the distance felt normal. So he did something simple. He started talking. He shared what he had been feeling, what he had avoided, what he feared. And little by little, they began to rebuild. Here's the lesson. Physical intimacy with a partner isn't just about performance or frequency. It's about invitation, about showing up with honesty, about choosing connection even when it's awkward or uncertain. Because the more you turn toward yourself out of habit, the easier it becomes to turn away from the people who matter. And sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is reach out. Now that we've talked about connection and distance, let's look even deeper. Because in some cases, masturbation doesn't just affect how you relate to others, it begins to shape how your brain works, what it expects, what it craves. And that brings us to one of the most overlooked but powerful parts of this conversation, the addictive loop of stimulation. Let's explore what happens when your brain gets wired for more, and more, and what you can do to break free. Tom never thought of himself as someone with an addiction. He didn't drink much, never touched drugs. He was a retired accountant, the kind of man who paid his bills early, walked his dog every morning, and kept his car spotless. But when it came to one habit, a quiet one done behind closed doors, he began to notice something was off. At first, it was harmless. A few videos online here and there. Just to relax, he told himself. To unwind after a long day. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the content became more intense. He found himself scrolling longer, seeking more, and the more he watched, the more ordinary content lost its effect. It was like chasing a high that kept moving further out of reach. What Tom didn't know, and what many men don't realize, is that this is exactly how the brain responds to overstimulation. Our minds are wired for novelty. Each time we engage with visual, sexual content, especially of increasing intensity, the brain releases a powerful surge of dopamine, the same chemical linked to motivation and reward. But over time, the brain adapts. It needs more stimulus to trigger the same response. What once felt exciting now feels dull, and the cycle begins: more time, more extreme material, less satisfaction. This is the quiet loop of dependence. Not because the person lacks discipline, but because the brain is simply doing what it's designed to do, seeking pleasure, avoiding discomfort, and reinforcing what feels good. But here's the twist. The very content that once brought pleasure begins to erode real-world intimacy. It trains the brain to expect unrealistic visuals, exaggerated sounds, hyper-stimulated scenarios. So when real-life moments arrive, soft, human, imperfect, the mind struggles to respond. The body disconnects. That's what happened to Tom. He began feeling numb, even during moments that should have felt intimate. He avoided dating altogether. Not out of shame, but out of fear that he wouldn't be able to perform, or worse, wouldn't feel anything at all. And that fear kept him in the loop even longer. Until one day, he decided to test something. He went 30 days without watching anything explicit. The first few days were difficult. His mind craved it. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. But instead, he filled the time differently. Phone calls with friends, walks without headphones, journaling his thoughts, reading books not to escape, but to reconnect. And something started to shift. His mind slowed down. His attention sharpened. He noticed small things again, the sound of the wind, the taste of his coffee, the warmth of a real smile. And when he finally found himself in an intimate moment again, it felt raw, real, beautiful. Here's the lesson. When we overfeed the brain with artificial stimulation, we starve it of the subtle joys of reality. But the brain can rewire. It just needs time, space, And the belief that real connection, though quieter, is always richer. So if you found yourself stuck in that loop, know this: you're not broken, you're simply human, and you can begin again. And speaking of beginning again, that brings us to the final piece of this journey, because now that we've seen how this habit can affect the body, the mind, and our relationships, the question becomes, what does a healthy, balanced relationship with self-pleasure actually look like? Let's talk about that. For Miguel, it wasn't about stopping. He had spent too many years trapped in cycles of guilt, shame, and silence, trying to quit cold turkey, making promises to himself, breaking them, feeling worse. But one day, something clicked. He was speaking with an old friend over lunch, someone who, like him, had gone through a divorce, struggled with loneliness, and quietly leaned on private habits to cope. The friend said something simple, but it landed deep. What if the goal isn't to stop, but to understand? Those words stayed with him. So, Miguel did something he had never done before. He began journaling after each time he pleasured himself. Not to judge, just to notice. What was he feeling before? What was he needing? How did he feel after? And slowly, a pattern emerged. Sometimes he realized the act left him feeling relaxed and connected, like a kind of meditation. Other times it left him feeling drained or empty, especially when it was done out of boredom or emotional avoidance. That simple awareness changed everything. Because here's the truth. Self-pleasure can be a powerful tool for well-being, but only when it's chosen with intention, not out of habit. When it's used to connect, not to escape. When it's one part of a whole, not the main source of relief or satisfaction. So, what does a healthy relationship with masturbation look like? It starts with presence. Ask yourself gently, not critically, why now am I feeling desire, or am I avoiding something? What do I truly need? It involves rhythm. Some men find that spacing out their solo time a few days apart, perhaps even choosing specific times, helps restore sensitivity and excitement. It becomes something to look forward to, not fall into. It means variety, exploring slower, less intense techniques, stepping away from screens, reconnecting with your senses, touch, breath, imagination, rather than relying on external images. And perhaps most importantly, it means balance. Because no single habit, no matter how comforting, should crowd out the other joys of being alive. Time in nature. Conversations that matter. Movement, laughter, stillness, spiritual practice, creativity, love. Miguel didn't quit. He recalibrated, and in doing so, he found that his relationship with himself and eventually with others began to feel softer, kinder, more real. So here's the quiet invitation. Don't fight yourself. Listen. Don't rush to stop. Slow down to understand. Your body is not the problem. Your pleasure is not the enemy. The real work is in bringing it back into harmony with who you are now and the kind of life you still want to build. Because the goal isn't just to manage an old habit. The goal is to come home to yourself. And now that we've walked through this journey from understanding your changing body to recognizing emotional patterns to reclaiming your energy relationships and mental clarity, we come to a final essential reminder, one that ties everything together. Let's wrap this up with clarity, with compassion, and with a quiet kind of strength. So here we are. After walking through the quiet, often unspoken realities of life after 50, the changes in the body, the emotions that come with solitude, the patterns that form in silence, maybe you're sitting there with a feeling that's hard to name. Maybe it's relief, maybe recognition, maybe a mix of gratitude and a little sadness for all the years you didn't know what you now do. And that's okay. because this conversation was never about shame. It was about awareness, about giving a voice to something so many men carry alone. Masturbation isn't wrong. It isn't weak. It isn't something to hide from. But like anything that becomes automatic, it deserves your attention. If you've ever felt disconnected from your body, unsure about your desire, or quietly dependent on a habit that no longer leaves you feeling whole, please know this. You are not broken. You are simply being invited to grow. And growth, especially at this stage in life, doesn't mean doing more. It often means doing less, but with more presence, more honesty, more care. Like David, who learned that reaching out to his partner brought back a kind of intimacy he thought was gone. Like Tom, who discovered that stepping back from digital stimulation helped him rediscover the beauty of real connection. Like Miguel, who turned a private habit into a mindful practice and in doing so found peace with himself again. And maybe like you, sitting here now, beginning to see your own journey in a new light. So here's my quiet wish for you, that you treat your body with kindness, that you allow your desires to evolve, that you hold your pleasure with the same tenderness you'd give to someone you love. Because at the heart of this whole conversation, beneath the science, the psychology, the stories, is something simple. You are still worthy of connection, of vitality, of joy, not just behind closed doors, but out in the world, in your relationships, in your mornings, in the way you carry yourself, breathe, move, and live. So take what resonated from this video, let go of what didn't. And if you feel moved, share this with someone else who might be quietly wondering too. And remember, this isn't the end of something. It's the beginning of a more honest, balanced, and compassionate relationship with your body, your habits, and your life. Thank you for spending this time with me. You are not alone. You never were, and your next chapter can begin whenever you choose.